do a more formal introduction in just a minute, but as our Holy Father, St. Benedict, begins his rule that we should begin every good work with a prayer, I'd like to invite Father Pascal Morlino, who is a monk at St. Vincent Abbey, to offer an invocation for us.
And alumnus of Belmont.
And an alumnus of Belmont Abbey Prep School and college and novitiate.
Well, nice to be here with all of you. Let us put ourselves in the presence of the loving, merciful God as we pray. Heavenly Father, send your Holy Spirit to open our minds and hearts and help us to delve into the intricacies of life that we hear presented this evening. We may do so with minds that are guided always by your mercy and your love. The Spirit may move us in all that we do, say, and think. Help us to be aware of the great call each of us has, the examples of that great love and mercy in the world in which we find ourselves. We ask this always, like the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thanks, Mark. Well, welcome. It's so good to see so many of you, many of whom I know, others who I'm just getting to know. My name is Dr. Joyce. I'm the Dean of the Honors College at Belmont Abbey College. Yeah, so this is Belmont House. Welcome to Belmont House. If you haven't been here before, we are very happy to have you. I'm going to introduce these guys in just a minute, but I just wanted to sort of begin by saying that the event we're having tonight in many ways mirrors the most important things that the Honors College is trying to pursue at Belmont Abbey College, and that is really two big things, one smaller thing, but the smaller thing is sort of the topic for tonight. The big things are the asking of the big questions together in community through the reading of the great books. So the asking of the big questions. The second is friendship. I think equally important in the Honors College of Belmont Abbey is friendship. We take Aristotle so seriously in the Ethics when he says that no man or woman would choose to live, even if they had all other goods, if they didn't have friends. And that highest form of friendship is the pursuing of truth and virtue together. And one of my alums who was at the Abbey, who's now in DC, once said, DC is hard because there's a lot of networking. There's a whole lot of networking events, and not a lot of opportunities for real friendship. And I hope that at the Belmont House, when we have events like this, there really will be the opportunity for that kind of friendship. The third really important thing for the Honors College is civic engagement. And so through the coursework, the 4-year Great Books program we offer at the Honors College of Belmont Abbey, there's definitely a focus within our program. Other programs may emphasize metaphysics more and math and science. Ours really does emphasize the active life. And all of our students take 2 courses in sophomore year and senior year. All of the Honors College students at Belmont Abbey take a course in the American founding, and then senior year they take a course on Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America and the Ancient Regime of the Revolution. So the questions of American democracy, liberty, virtue, and the American regime are very important to us. So tonight we are here, importantly thanks to the Jack Miller Center. Through their generosity, we were able to host 2 Constitution Day events this year. We normally have one on campus, and we will on Friday. Dr. Susan Hansen from the University of Dallas will be giving a talk on George Washington and patriotism on Friday. But tonight, thanks to Jack Miller Center, we were able to offer a second Constitution Day event, and that's what this is in celebration of. And since we are a Catholic college at Belmont Abbey, we thought we might ask the question about the relationship between Catholicism and the Constitution, if there is any. So the title of tonight is Rome and the Republic, Catholics and the Constitution. Thanks to Dr. Sean Riley for that title. If you're not familiar with Constitution Day, probably most of you in the DC area are, September 17th is the anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. And the, 49 are left? There are 49 delegates left? 55, I think. That sign? Our credibility is shot already.
Maybe I'm optimistic.
Signed the Constitution in Philadelphia before sending it out to the states to be ratified. And so we celebrate this every year to commemorate our constituting document that has been around for 200 plus years. It's only been amended 27 times. That's a pretty good track record. And we come to ask questions about it, to think about it. We constituted ourselves in 1787 when it was signed, 88 when it's ratified in 88. But the question that Hamilton poses in Federalist 1 about the experiment of self-government is still an open question. And so we come every year and we think about that question. So let me introduce these guys first, and then I'm going to raise a few questions. It's really going to be an informal conversation between the three of us for about a half an hour, and then we're going to open it up to you, to all of you, to engage the speakers and one another. And then we'll go back to informal time of drinking, eating, and one of the other Honors College traditions at Belmont Abbey is the singing of Irish pub songs. There is a guitar in my car, so if those of you who stay past an hour and a half, 2 hours, Finnegan's Wake will be played outside of the back. So let me, the friendship tonight, I said, right, one of the most important things about tonight is the friendship. These two men have been my friends for gosh, when did we, 2006? Since 2006, yeah. Jerome and I met at Baylor University, and we've known each other since then. He's been to Belmont Abbey 3 or 4 times now. It's been a delight to be Jerome's friend, to work with him in indirect ways over the years. Dr. Sean Riley, I am extremely grateful for his friendship. He was the first person to do a sort of public piece on the Honors College about 5-6 years ago. Yeah, when he was at ACTA, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, he did an interview with me for the blog. And since then, we owe all our success to that first article, I think, and however many clicks it got. But Dr. Foss is a professor of politics at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where he also serves as the endowed director for the St. Vincent Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, and a fellow in the college's Center for Political and Economic Thought. Dr. Foss teaches courses in American political thought, Catholic political thought, political philosophy, and literature and politics. He was recognized in 2021 as with St. Vincent's prestigious Thorburn Award for Teaching Excellence. As director of the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, Foss directs a Rome program, edits an in-house journal entitled Conversatio. We have a podcast called Conversatio. Yeah, we had the idea that you guys. Just kidding. He directs an interdisciplinary minor in the sanctity of life, leads reading groups, and hosts several academic events. His publications include several articles and 2 books, most recently, Flannery O'Connor and the Perils of Governing by Tenderness. Foss serves on the board of directors for the Society of Catholic Social Scientists. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Dallas and his doctorate from Baylor University. He resides in Latrobe with his wife and 8 children. Catching up. 7's on the way. I wasn't even married by the time he had 2 or 3 at Baylor.
Keep trying.
Someday I'll be Dr. Sean Riley is a senior director for advancement and programs at the American Ideas Institute, which publishes American Conservative, where he leads fundraising efforts, advises on strategy, and directs the Constitutional Fellows Program. He is also a visiting fellow and lecturer at Hillsdale College's Van Andel Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C., where he teaches courses on political philosophy and government. He has previously held positions at several nonprofit organizations in Washington, D.C., focused on veterans policy, education policy, and philanthropy. He holds a PhD in political theory and American government from the Catholic University of America, and a master's from St. John's College, Annapolis, where he studied philosophy, political theory, and literature. As an undergraduate, he studied political science at the University of Delaware. Sean served as an enlisted infantryman in the Army National Guard for 9 years, which included overseas tours in Iraq and Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Native of Delaware, he lives in Hyattsville, Maryland, with his wife and 2 daughters. Welcome, thank you so much.
I got one.
What's that? The blood, keep the low blood pressure while you're at it. So, to begin, you might just ask a sort of basic question, and that is, what do Catholicism and Catholic teaching and the Constitution have to do with one another? And on a simple, explicit level, the answer might be nothing, really. The Catholic Church doesn't explicitly have any teachings about the United States Constitution, whether it's good or bad, the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution doesn't speak about Catholicism or Christianity, although it has a line in there that no religious oaths can be administered to officers taking roles in the government. It has the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, but in a certain sense you might say, well, there's nothing explicitly there. But, and my former students will know, there's only 5 minutes before I would reference Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, makes the claim that religion in America, and Christianity in particular, even though they don't govern directly, should be understood as America's first political institution. So even though we have a Constitution with a First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, Alexis de Tocqueville says Christianity and religion are the first institution, political institution of the United States. And so, I think serious Catholics should love America. Americans who think deeply about religion and its relationship to political life have thought deeply about the question of the relationship between Christianity and specifically Catholicism and our Constitution. Now, I think a lot lately, when it comes to this question, has kind of been done at a higher level than the Constitution. What I mean by that is, one of the big questions that seems to be discussed both academically and in sort of popular articles and debates is the relationship between Catholicism and liberal democracy. Are these things compatible? Is liberal democracy neutral when it comes to religion? Is it hostile? And I think that's a really interesting question, and I think we may sort of organically get there at some point tonight. On the other hand, people have really spent time looking at the specifics of policy, right? How should Catholics, what types of public policy should Catholics endorse, promote, things like family policy, just war theory, economic policy. What I want to begin with tonight is sort of something in between sort of the liberal and political theory question and the policy question, that is the Constitution itself. So the first question I'll maybe pose to our speakers tonight would be, to what extent do Catholicism, its moral and political teachings, its natural law tradition, to what extent are they compatible with, supportive of, or are supported by the Constitution, or to what extent are they in tension? And so you're free to talk about whatever you want in terms of what you think might be the most interesting areas of the Constitution.
Okay. Good. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Belmont Abbey and to Dr. Wysocki here for, first of all, for the delight of your friendship. It's a delight to be your friend too, and for hosting this event and for inviting me to be a part of it. It's a great pleasure to be here, so thank you. There's a lot I want to say in response to your introduction, but maybe I'll just start sort of broadly with the Constitution as a whole. A few clauses I have in mind too, you may get to, but if the answer to your question about what does the Catholic Church have to do with the Constitution, if the answer is, well, not much, in 1787, that was a step in the right direction, because the colonial governments that Americans were living under at the time did have something to do with the Catholic Church, and it was a bad thing, right? That for just about every colony, Catholicism was outlawed. It was illegal to practice the Catholic faith openly. It was illegal for Catholics to participate in government, to hold office. It was illegal to send your kids to Catholic schools, so that's why the Carroll family went to Europe for schooling. So the big news for Catholics when they saw the Constitution that came out of the Convention of Philadelphia in 1787 is that it wasn't anti-Catholic. It doesn't have anything to say for or against the church, and the chances, just within the historical context, the chances of the Constitution saying anything favorable to the church was pretty slim, right? But the fact that the Catholics of America were now on an equal playing field with other Christian denominations was a good thing, and that the clause that you mentioned, the prohibition on religious tests, was an invitation for Catholics to participate in the political life of the nation, and states, new states that are formed, were encouraged to do likewise, to drop any laws that would have discriminated against Catholics participating in government. That, it's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but part of the idea of the Republican Guarantee Clause was to ensure that there would be open participation. It's not as clearly favorable towards Catholics as the No Religious Oath Clause. The Oath Clause, by the way, for keeping tracks at the end of Article 6, and it just says you can't, there's no religious test, but you do have to take an oath to hold office. So that's the only requirement. You have to take an oath. But Catholics are comfortable taking an oath to support the Constitution, so long as the Constitution itself is not hostile to their faith. And there's nothing else that I can think of that was clearly hostile to the Catholic faith in the Constitution. So that's my preliminary answer to the question.
Yeah. So great point there. I think it's absolutely true that Catholics were proscribed across the colonies. I think going more to a moving kind of from the historical level to the kind of theoretical level, I think what we might suggest when we think about the Constitution and what it does, right, what it's for. Well, first of all, we might make a distinction, as like Orestes Brownson does, Catholic thinker in the 19th century. He wrote a book called The American Republic right at the end of the Civil War, 1865, in which I think he'd lost at least two of his sons. And so he's thinking very deeply about, as a Catholic convert, what is the meaning of the Constitution, and what is the Constitution? And he suggested there are actually two constitutions. There's the unwritten Constitution, and then there's the written Constitution, which we think about that. That's the one that's ratified on September 17th. That's the one that obviously we have clauses, we have kind of that actually gives structure to our government and our political order. But there's another way in which that kind of captures a deeper sensibility, right? And one that resonates with and is informed by the broader Western tradition, dating all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans, and of which the Catholic Church has been and continues to be the kind of vessel of. And so even though they would have explicitly denied it, right, many of those that prescribed Catholics sort of being involved in public life explicitly, there's a deeper way in which many of the sensibilities that they brought to thinking about human nature, for example, and justice, and these sorts of things, the things that go into the Constitution, the things that are inform the actual structure of the Constitution, are deeply informed at that level by Catholic philosophical and anthropological and political thought. And so I think that if we look for it, we can find explicit things like the clause you mentioned. We might also think about the mention of the law of nations, right? Jus gentium is the Latin term. This was part of the, well, it goes back to the Romans actually, but it was, again, carried forward through Catholic political thought through the Middle Ages. That gets used, right? Because there's a clause in the Constitution that says that Congress has the power to define and punish piracy and other violations of the Jus gentium, or the law of nature. And so there's these kind of, as I say, there's these sort of deeper, at this deeper sort of theoretical level and anthropological level, I think. There's also the kind of sensibility that human nature is flawed in some kind of way and not perfectible. And so has to be constrained within these institutions. Power is kind of dangerous. Why is power dangerous? Power is dangerous because human beings have this thing, right? We would call it, Catholics would call it, and most Christians would call it original sin, right? That term doesn't appear in the Constitution, but to my mind, it clearly informs the kinds of institutions that are set up. So.
If men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? Federal
Precisely.
51, sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, you might, the other Federalist paper to maybe look at is 37, where Madison argues at this very point that a perfect constitution really can't be expected. If we're thinking that government's going to solve all of our problems, we've already made a mistake, right? Government's not going to fix all of our problems. The point is not to have a perfect government, it's to have a decent government, hopefully a good government, but not a government that's going to be perfect. And so there really is a sobriety to the Constitution and to the drafters of the Constitution. They know that there's improvements that they are making on the Articles of Confederation, and they're hoping that future generations can improve the project that they're starting, but there's not even really an inkling of a hope that we would ever reach perfection through government, right? Which means you need something else for people to look to for perfection.
Right.
Good. How about this? Before we get into interpretation of parts of the Constitution, where things maybe go off the rails, is there anything in the Constitution itself that's just sort of on its face, if not hostile, to a religious way of life, to Catholicism, to Christianity, might be sort of in tension with it, might be something that needs to be overcome, or just sort of in tension with Christianity, Catholicism? Any thoughts about anything?
Did you go first this time?
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on, I think the answer is it depends. It depends on how liberal you think so it kind of is going to take us to this question of Constitution, to interpretation, because it depends on how liberal you think the Constitution is. Obviously, the interpretive tradition that we get in the 20th century suggests yes, right? If that tradition is correct, it seems like yes, right? That there is something that is probably in tension. So then we have to ask, is that interpretive tradition? So I don't think we have to go there
Sure.
to understand the question. I think as written, and this is why originalism probably has its limits, but it can kind of act as a protective in some kind of way, because I don't think, as I say, if we understand the Constitution as informed by this deeper Western tradition, it's actually not that liberal. It certainly incorporates aspects and elements of liberalism, reminiscent, reflecting the time that it was written, right? This sort of this kind of some of the Enlightenment ideas and that sort of thing. But I don't think at the deepest levels that's really its sources. I'm kind of persuaded by the argument that George Carey and Wilmore Kendall make, that the basic symbols of our tradition go much deeper, right? All the way back, and they argue all the way back to the Mayflower Compact, which is very not liberal. And so I think it really depends on how you think about what the meaning of the Constitution is, but I don't think in the kind of text itself, I don't find anything that's explicitly, it just comes out of that interpretive tradition.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree that it depends on how we interpret parts of the Constitution. And if we're just looking at the Constitution that comes out of the convention in 1787, there's really not much there that I think Catholics have to worry about. The anthropology, as Sean was saying, that the Constitution assumes is that humans are communal, they're social, they're political. What we're trying to do in the Constitution is not, as I said, perfection, but a more perfect union, not a perfect union, but an improved union. But it's a union, right? It's a group of people living together. And here's what the sorts of laws Congress can pass and what they can't do. Here's what the limitations are. Here's what we expect from the president. Here's what we expect from the judiciary. But it all has to serve the common good as understood in the preamble, which is things like justice and tranquility, common defense. Right? So you get a sense that there's a community here. That's good. What's in tension with the original Constitution is the idea of individual rights that we get in the Bill of Rights. And I think from a Catholic point of view, that's where I would look as kind of where the potential problem is. I'm not sure it is a problem, but the potential problem, and I think it depends on how we understand the Bill of Rights. And if we understand the Bill of Rights as giving individuals power over the community, that is, I think, maybe where some of the ideas of liberalism could sneak in. And I think, Hamilton, not a Catholic, but he sort of has this Catholic sensibility. When he warns against having a Bill of Rights, part of what he's worried about is that Americans will identify more easily and readily with the Bill of Rights, and they'll come to think of the government as kind of the boogeyman that's out to get their rights, and it will start to break down community. And I think that's kind of the Catholic worry with the Bill of Rights too.
Or even primarily as the enforcer of my individual, even more
right.
problematic.
Right, yeah.
Becomes the enforcer, against, so that it,
The source of rights, yeah,
yes,
exactly, right, yeah.
Which is what we see in the kind of 20th century interpretation,
Yeah,
I think.
right. I do think the drafters of the Bill of Rights, which is primarily James Madison, but one of the people who helps him, especially with the First Amendment, is Daniel Carroll, who's part of the Carroll family, and he's Catholic. Clearly supported the First Amendment. But as I often tell my students, what Congress offers to the states to ratify is not 10 amendments, it's 12 amendments. And if you look at the 2 amendments that end up not being ratified initially, right, they're the first 2. And they're not at all about rights, right? They're about the structure of Congress. And then you get to the 3rd Amendment, which we call the First Amendment, which is about some clarifying some limitations upon what Congress can do legislatively. Right? And then the next several amendments deal with limitations to the executive, and the next several deal with limitations to the judiciary. So it mirrors the structure of the Constitution itself. And then the last 2, what we call 9 and 10, are sort of miscellaneous general things, just like the last couple clauses, last couple articles of the Constitution are more general. Right? So it's meant to mirror the structure of the Constitution, which I think is supposed to mitigate the effects of thinking about this as a bill of individual rights. Of course, nobody interprets it that way, but if we could get back, or maybe for the first time, to thinking of the Bill of Rights the way Madison and Daniel Carroll were thinking of it, I think that might mitigate some of these harms that we get. We would no longer think of the government as providing us with rights, but rather the government is helping us to reach some kind of common good.
In partnership, by the way, with these other civil institutions, right?
Yeah.
To go back to our Tocqueville, right? So that sort of suggests a way of thinking about. So we ask, how is religion the first political institution? Well, if you understand it that way, it's not a problem, right? It's not. It's because it doesn't set. The government is working not in tension with but as a part of this kind of more communal whole, working toward the common good, government, religious institutions, educational institutions, et cetera, are all working kind of toward the same thing, where when you get that sort of individualist, if you want, interpretation, it becomes one against the other. And so the Tocquevillian kind of interpretation starts to break down and not to hold any longer.
Well, I know this one's been talked about a lot, certainly in the Catholic social media world and podcasters and YouTubers. But, so maybe it's been done to death. I want to give you guys a chance to address it. I have certain students, for example, more traditional Catholic students who like to talk a lot about the heresy of Americanism. Is that Leo the 13th?
Pius IX.
It's Pius IX.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The errors, solus errors, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so this primarily has to do with the separation of church and state and the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. So if somebody, I think they would posit, for example, on its face, right? Forget about interpretation, on its face, the first part of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This is really problematic for a Catholic. So, go.
You know what's funny is one reason I became a college professor is because I thought this was a career where I could sort of avoid social media,
I know.
right? Like, I'm just going to teach Aristotle and Alexis de Tocqueville and the Federalist Papers. Why would I ever have to care about what was saying on social media? And here we are. So
They have more authority over us. I mean, they're coming to us. This is just
I know,
a side,
yeah.
right? We have to sort of fight for. It's like Socrates with certain interlocutors, like
yeah,
where we're going.
yeah,
Just listen to me for a minute, not just for a minute.
right.
But it's
yeah.
hard. It's really difficult. They come with these presuppositions from.
Yeah,
these,
right.
you know, and,
No, it's interesting because, as I said, Daniel Carroll really very clearly liked the Establishment Clause because at the time, what everybody understood by the Establishment Clause, I think most clearly was we're not going to have a Church of America like England has a Church of England. And what Catholics understood by that was we can participate because there's not an established church here. And so most Catholics were, at the time, I mean, there weren't many, but they were quite happy with the First Amendment. John Carroll, the first bishop, had a very healthy respect for George Washington. He had a friendship with Benjamin Franklin. He knew several of the founders, and he wrote 2 eulogies for George Washington when George Washington died. And, they read almost like hagiography. It's sort of surprising just how much John Carroll respected, although he understands Washington's career, kind of reinterprets it in a Catholic light and thinks about him being an instrument of providence. It's really interesting. So, yeah, it's the Americanism thing. It's the history of that is that what Pius is really worried about are some things that are going on in France, not America. And the word Americanism comes from a French translation of an American work that was very controversial in France. And there's some debate about how accurate the translation was, but it was the introduction that wasn't a translation, it was the translator's introduction, I believe, that was really at issue. And people, the French thought these ideas were coming out of America, right? These liberal ideas. And the Pope wanted to address these ideas, and so he used the word Americanism, but he was also in conversation. The Pope, but also other members of the Curia in Rome were in conversation with Cardinal Gibson in America about these things, and just flat out asking, is the American Church guilty of these things? And Cardinal Gibbon said, oh no, we are not guilty of this at all. We're on the same page with Pope Pius. And of course, part of the debate, I mean, when people read these things, is Gibson, is he correct? I mean, is he being honest? Is he correct? Does he really understand what's going on here? but certainly gives some thought that that the controversy was really in France, not America, and that it was just sort of this unfortunate fact that the name given to this set of ideas was Americanism.
Yeah, so I'm not as steeped in the history, so I'll let that stand for what it is. But just kind of going to the substance of the question, it seems to me that we have to make a distinction. An Americanism, if it's named, if it means what it's kind of commonly taken to mean, is problematic from a Catholic perspective. What is not problematic, in fact, what is virtuous, is patriotism. And I even there's this whole debate about nationalism versus patriotism. I don't mean to make that distinction here. That's a different question. But I do think that patriotism is an aspect of piety, and it's an aspect, and that's of justice. And so, in the same way that our father, right, our fatherland, our patria, in the same way that we owe honor to our natural parents, we also owe honor to our country. And it doesn't mean we always agree with everything that it does, in the same way that it means, in the same way that if we disagree with our natural father, that it means we hate him, right? So we have to make this distinction. I think it's an important one to make. If Americanism means some kind of ideology that says, my country, right or wrong, maybe is sometimes how you put it, or that America is somehow the highest good, or something like that, I think it could be problematic if that's what it means. Again, letting all that history stand. So I think a better way to think about it is this kind of question, or a better way for Catholics to think about it is this idea of patriotism, and to think about it as a virtue and something that is actually, in fact, owed. It's not optional. St. Augustine, right, was clearly, to my mind, a Roman patriot when I read him, and was very interested in Roman history, very interested in, and I name him because he's usually the one that's sort of pointed to as kind of, he had this negative view of politics, he wanted to downgrade the patria and all that sort of thing. In a way, that's true, right? He wants to downgrade it vis-a-vis the Civitas Dei, but he also thinks that that's very important to us. And there's a famous letter in which a Roman general, I believe it was, who had converted to Christianity, asked him, now I'm retiring, or should I retire now and become a monk? And he says, no, we need people like you doing exactly what you're doing because Rome matters. Rome needs to be defended, right, at its borders. So I think it depends on what we mean by that. So to the question of the First Amendment, as is that inherently heresy? I don't think so. I don't buy that. But again, I think it depends on how it's understood, right? Again, it's a question of interpretation. I do think that the 20th century sort of interpretive tradition that we get is a problem, right? And I think that it should be questioned, right, by pious Catholics. But that doesn't mean that that's the only right and only interpretation, and that doesn't mean that it is inherently heresy, say, to love your country. In fact, it's not. It's virtuous.
Yeah, one of the nice things about the First Amendment is that there's two religious clauses, right? You get the Establishment Clause, then you also get the Free Exercise Clause. And it's sort of unfortunate that Jefferson's interpretation of the Establishment Clause just caught on like wildfire, and the Supreme Court, as soon as it incorporated the Establishment Clause and applied it to the states, used Jefferson's interpretation. I've never done a super scientific survey on this, but I would imagine that a lot of, maybe most informed Americans actually think the words separation of church and state are in the Constitution. Right?
Yeah.
Those are Jefferson's words. And the image, right, there's not really any images in the Constitution, but that image of a wall separating these two things has, I think, done quite a bit of harm. And some of the free exercise / establishment cases this most recent term in the Supreme Court are sort of interesting because in 2 or 3 of them that I could think of, what's going on is states or municipalities are afraid that they're going to violate the separation of church and state. They're afraid they're going to be in violation of the Establishment Clause, and so they prohibit voucher programs, or they won't raise a Christian flag in front of City Hall, or they won't let a football coach kneel and say a prayer after a football game. Not because they think these things are inherently wrong, but they're afraid that they'll be breaking the Constitution. And in every case, the court said this year, you're not breaking the Constitution when you do these things. And they're, I think, trying to get citizens to think more about the free exercise clause and not think less of the Establishment Clause, but not to be afraid of it the way that a lot of people seem to be afraid of it.
Yeah, and Tocqueville actually points out that in France, where the church and the state have been combined too much, it actually ended up being detrimental to the church, and because when the political regime lost legitimacy, so did the church. It dragged it down with it, and France is still much more secular than today, right? As a result of that, laïcité and all this still stands as a result, largely of the delegitimization of the church in France. We have our own problems, different problems, but the church in the United States is much stronger and much more, kind of viewed as legitimate, I think, at a more fundamental level, particularly as a public voice and kind of a public witness. It's not that the church, the church isn't in danger of being illegal there, but it doesn't have the kind of public voice and legitimacy that it once had, and it goes all the way back to that. So Tocqueville points this out, and he argues that that's actually why it actually is better for the church to not be connected that way, because political regimes change, that they come and go, they lose legitimacy.
When religion acts like a man, it loses the long-term power, legitimate power it has to save souls.
Right, exactly.
I'll ask 2 more short ones, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So we've skirted around interpretation. With the overturning of Roe, for most Catholics, weekly Mass attending Catholics, this was a writing of an interpretive wrong. And so it wasn't that the Constitution as written was problematic there, but there was it went off the rails in terms of interpretation. That's been righted. And now it allows for political action on that issue. For Catholics, what's the next most important wrong to right in terms of interpretational derailment in the Constitution? For us, what do you think might be the most important?
I think I'd have to go with marriage. I think I'd have to go with the Bergfell. I think that issue is fundamental to our kind of conception of the human person, to how we think about the family and how we think about society. I mean, again, if the church can be, or if religion can be viewed as the first political institution, the family's got to be the second, right? And a correct public understanding of the family underpins so much. The destruction of the family has been disastrous, and I think the loss of a right understanding, public understanding of marriage continues to be disastrous. And so I think it's got to be marriage.
Yeah, I'll agree, but before I say why, we go back to the Constitution and maybe say one more thing, which I think is an agreement with Brownson, Augustus Brownson, that one way in which the Constitution is pro-Catholic, not explicitly, but sort of inherently, is it's meant to establish the parameters for Republican government. And so the Constitution is not going to give people all the answers, public policy answers. It's just going to say, here's the boundaries, here's the procedures, now go do it, right? It's a republic if you can keep it. And so Brownson really latches onto that in the American Republic and says, look, Catholics have a great opportunity here to persuade their fellow citizens to adopt good public policies that are in keeping with Catholic teaching. And you don't have to say anything about Catholic teaching. You can just use reason, right? And Catholics, if they're well educated and they're educated in morality, ethics, politics, rhetoric, they can go out and make a big difference in America, right? And so, consistent with that, in the Dobbs case, the court isn't saying anything really for or against abortion. They're just saying it's not in the Constitution, right? You can't come to the judiciary and let us settle this difficult moral question for you. You have to figure it out, right? And when it comes to abortion, the country's really split on this. So you're gonna have some states that prohibit it, some states that allow it, right? Nothing changes at all after Dobbs in like California. So I would agree, right? Obergefell, which the constitutional argument for Obergefell is almost identical to Roe, right? It's based on the same constitutional principles. And there's a lot of other sort of privacy case law that is argued exactly the same way. I think from a judicial standpoint, that would be the right call to put this back into public play through legislatures. I'm not sure, right, Catholics would really have their work cut out for them, I think, in every state to actually get same-sex marriage prohibited. I think it would.
It's harder than abortion.
Than abortion, yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
but I mean, don't forget, in 2006 or something,
Right.
California passed it. So, I mean, you're right, but it's, I think it goes to the teaching function of law, right? You've seen this, the public opinion shift on this, not as a function of being convinced, but as a function of, I think for most people, but as a function of sort of the teaching function of the law. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah,
Work is cut out.
Right.
But largely because of, I think of that.
No, I that's really some of the biggest harm Obergefell did. And it's funny that Roe didn't have the same effect on public opinion, right? But I remember the day after Obergefell talking to my neighbor, who knows I'm a political scientist, and she's asking me about Obergefell. And the thing she was really worried about is that, you know, she's always been opposed to same-sex marriage. Now she feels like she's sort of on the wrong side of history. And I think that was a common sentiment, right?
Yeah.
That people viewed Obergefell more like a civil rights case.
Yeah.
Whereas nobody really had that view with abortion. And it's kind of what Alito says in his Dobbs opinion, is abortion's different. He doesn't really explain what's different about it, right? From a constitutional point of view, but it's different in the public's perception.
Yeah.
So, but I agree that Obergefell did a lot of damage, and it would be, you know, Catholics and others who want to reason about public policy or have a really big prejudice to overcome at this point.
Yeah. Agreed.
The last one's kind of a fun one
Okay.
that I warned you about earlier. Less to do with the Constitution, but I'm sure we'll come back to that in the questions. Dr. Foss, as I mentioned in his introduction, wrote a book on Flannery O'Connor and politics. And Dr. Riley wrote his dissertation on St. Thomas More, on Utopia. Is that right? Yeah. So I'm going to ask if Flannery and Thomas More are alive. Thomas More, a character in her Catholic counterpart Walker Percy's novels, right, Dr. Thomas More?
Yeah, right.
If they were alive, and they could comment on the American regime to give us a warning or instruction, what would be their advice for us?
You go first.
I told you
Thomas Moore's in the room.
There you go, yeah.
I told you this morning I was going to ask, so I
He's
didn't have
watching
much
us,
time
yeah.
to prepare.
Watching over us. Well, look, I mean, I think Moore was very concerned with continuities, very concerned with tradition, the importance of maintaining both in the political and in the ecclesial realm. I mean, that he died, you know, a political martyr, but he died because he was defending the church's teaching, or at least he refused to assent to a breaking of the church's teaching. And so I think in some ways it's less his it's less what he would say and more kind of his example, right? His example is this: he's a statesman. In Utopia, the whole kind of debate within Utopia is, or one of the themes there is, should philosophers or should good people advise kings, right? Is it possible to actually make a difference doing that? Or is it just all too corrupt, and is it better to just live as you please, right? And kind of contemplate and do what you want? And his answer in Utopia is no, you need to get involved and try to make a difference. We don't abandon the ship just because we cannot control the winds, right? Dr. Me and students know this well. And so that, there's that, but then there's also a limit to that, right? The limit comes when he becomes a martyr and says, thus far and no further. He's sitting in his cell in the Tower of London, and his wife's coming to him, his daughters are coming to him, his friends are coming to him saying, please just sign the dang paper and just be done with this. Like, why you, and there's a point at which you cannot violate your conscience. And conscience, by the way, it does not simply mean, if you've ever seen the Robert Bolt movie, it's a great movie, but my one complaint with it is that Robert Bolt's an atheist, and he's sort of holding up more as this martyr for conscience. He wasn't a martyr for conscience, or at least not in the way that Robert Bolt thinks so. He's a martyr for conscientia, knowing with, right? It's a knowledge with others in community over time, and it's sort of, it's not this kind of Promethean concept of conscience. But he's bearing witness, right? He's a martyr means witness, so he's bearing witness to something that's greater than himself. And so there are two modes in which you do that: the statesman and the martyr, right? So he played the statesman role as long as he could, working within the system and trying to influence, but there comes a limit to that. And so we have to use prudence to determine where that limit is, but we should be warned.
What I want you to say is, you should say, America would have been a good country if somebody had held a gun to their head the entire time.
That's good, yeah. There'd been someone there to.
I don't know the exact line.
There'd been someone there to shoot at every moment of its life. Yeah. Well, there's something to that, even with nations, right? When you have existential crises, you tend to become better. So, Connor was careful not to say much that was really directly political, but she was really interested in politics and political philosophy. I love her stories, I love her correspondence, I love her essays, but I think my favorite thing she wrote was an introduction to a book about a little 12-year-old girl named Mary Ann who had cancer, terminal cancer. She had a tumor on her face that deformed her face, and she ended up staying at a cancer home in Atlanta that was run by Dominican sisters, and that order of Dominicans was founded by Rose Hawthorne, the daughter of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And they had come to Flannery, who lived in Georgia, had come to O'Connor and asked her to write a story about this saintly girl who nobody knew because she lived in this cancer home and she was deformed, but she was had this burning love for God and a love for other people, and they thought people should know about her. And if you've ever read anything by Flannery O'Connor, you know she doesn't really write that kind of thing, right? She doesn't write stories about feel-good sort of stories. Yeah. So she declined, but she said, I'll be happy to help you find an editor and to look over your manuscript, give you some pointers and whatnot. And then she ended up writing the introduction to the book, and it's a beautiful essay. And that's where the title for my book comes from. Is from that essay. That she warns us to be careful about tenderness as a governing principle, because it's in the name of tenderness that we sometimes allow ourselves to do really horrendous things. And this comes out in her stories often. So there's references in several of her stories to the Holocaust, and they seem out of place in a way. But part of her point is that what led to the Holocaust. in a weird way, it was tenderness, right? It was people who really thought they were doing a good thing, that they were making the future of humanity better. And it led them to be okay with the brutal murder of millions of people. And think especially of the disabled in the Holocaust, right? If we could just get rid of these people, we're actually doing something good. Sort of sickening, but that's what they thought. And when you start looking at some things in America, we think, well, gosh, I'm glad we don't have the Holocaust. But even the issues we were just talking about, I mean, what the argument for abortion is really an argument of tenderness. Right? The argument for same-sex marriage is really an argument of tenderness. So I think her advice would be, when you see tenderness, when you see people saying, we need to do this because it's good for all of us, to just be wary. I mean, there might be things that really are good and seem tender, but don't give in to the temptation just to be tender. Make sure you're also being good.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to the audience for some questions, but feel free now if you want to go up and grab drinks to do that while we're having them. This is a bit more informal. So, but first, I just want to
Yeah, I don't know if this is a big question or if it's a softball question, so I'll lean on your expertise, and Joe, I'd love for you to weigh in as well. And this topic has kind of been touched on, danced around for the entire night, but when I look at the title of this discussion, it's Rome and the Republic, Catholics and the Constitution. Another way you can read that is Rome is to the Republic as Catholicism is to the Constitution. Knowing that the Roman Republic failed, I guess I'd love for you guys to zero in a little bit more about Rome and the Republic and talk about how there might be lessons learned from things that we did right, things that were done wrong, and how we can apply that to present day, because regimes fall, and I'd love your insights on that.
Good. Yeah, you caught me at a good time. Just was in Rome this summer teaching a course on Roman political thought. So yeah, there's lots of lessons. What's really interesting in most political science programs, mine, probably yours at Belmont Abbey, our political theory courses tend to focus on the Greeks, right? For classical political thought, you go to the Greeks, and you should. They're, Plato and Aristotle. It doesn't get better than that. But when you read the American founders, yes, there's references to Socrates and Plato. There's a lot more references to the Romans. It's all over the place in the Federalist Papers, and the Anti-Federalists too are referring to the Romans.
Even the name Publius, right?
The names Publius, Brutus, Agrippa, Cato. That because they are all classically educated, they are steeped in Roman thought, right? When they're learning Latin, they're reading Cicero, and so that's something we've really lost in America, right, since the founding. And what they're learning from Rome, what the American founders are learning from Rome, are about their mistakes, right? So I'll just give you one example, right? There's many, but this is just an institutional example. There's probably moral examples too, but the institutional example is that when the Romans got rid of their king, they thought any executive office where there's just one person would be a monarchy. And so their primary executive was the consul, but there were two of them. And it was a very weak executive, and the result was when they had a crisis, they had to suspend government and appoint a dictator. And at the beginning of Federalist 70, Hamilton points this out and says, this is an improvement we can make on the Romans. Right? He names the Romans in particular. Right? And that's his defense of the unitary executive. That we can have basically a monarchy, but we can make it Republican, and we can make it safe. And we'll be superior to the Romans in this way. So that's sort of an institutional argument on what we can learn from the Romans. But I think you're asking more about some of the moral lessons we can learn from the Romans.
Perhaps, yes.
And I think there's some things there, and I think Augustine's really the person to go to understand what the Romans get wrong morally,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
That's my pitch to Sean.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the Republic was it decayed over time, of course, and so Augustine catches it sort of, well, he's inspired to write the City of God after 410, after it's sacked, right after Rome is sacked by the Visigoths. And so, this is, it's hard to kind of overstate. It actually wasn't super functionally disastrous, but symbolically it was devastating. Because, it wasn't actually, most of the stuff actually wasn't run out of Rome at that point, et cetera, but psychologically, symbolically, it was incredibly devastating. And so St. Augustine is basically writes City of God to say, hey, yes, Rome was great, in lots of ways, limited in other ways, and don't despair. Basically, there's something higher. So I think there's lots morally that we can learn from Rome. But if returning kind of back to the question of Catholics and the Constitution, I think that St. Augustine has a lot to tell us. In that moment, there may or may not be things that we can do to shore up the regime to the extent that we can, we should. That's a prudential question. There are things that we can learn if you read the histories, et cetera. But I think the bigger question for Catholics is sort of keeping our sights on the higher thing, but not also letting the higher thing cloud our vision about the kind of lower things, but understanding rightly our allegiance is to both. And we're citizens of two cities, right? As long as we are sojourners here, as he says. And so, we owe allegiance to two, and so we have to figure out how to navigate that, right? And we have to figure out how to utilize the insights that we gain from being citizens of the City of God to shore up our regime, to be not only patriots, but like better patriots, some of the best, right? He even says, he actually says, being a Christian shouldn't make you a worse patriot, it should make you a better one. It should make you a better soldier, it should make you a better citizen, etc. And so, that I think is the lesson that we should learn, sort of at the end of, if we are in fact at the end or something like that, or if our republic is decaying or something like that. I don't know. That's another question. But thinking as Catholics, that's I think how we should be thinking about it.
Yeah. One point on this that, and Augustine talks about this at the beginning of the City of God, but you could go to Rome today and you could see these huge basilicas, right? And why were they built so big, right? They're all over the place and they're so big. And when you look at the architecture of the Roman temples to the pagan gods, right? They're up high, and you're not allowed to enter them unless you're a priest of that cult, right? They're not for the people. And so when the Christians are allowed to start building churches openly, legally, they take the basilica, which was a Roman building, a public building used for public business, not religious business, not religion. And they use the basilica, a public building, for religion. And so no longer do you have these gods who are unapproachable. You have a God who is approachable that welcomes the public. And Augustine talks a lot about those basilicas at the beginning of the City of God because they become refuges for Romans, all Romans, Christian and not Christian, during the sack of Rome.
Yeah.
And I think part of his point is that Christianity, Catholicism, it really should be having this saving influence in any society. And so we can take, I think, that lesson from the early Roman Christians.
Good.
Is it me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't know if it was
Yeah,
something.
sorry.
To follow up on Tocqueville's point on religion as the first institution, he wrote that at a time when the populace generally was religious. Would he write that now? And because I think that he wouldn't, does that start to mean that perhaps what has become a community of individuals rather than like a tethering would that be more in tension with Catholicism and the state? Secular individuals, I should clarify.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, right? I mean, I think we've become more atomized and also more top-down ruled in some sense, right, at the same time. And they're two sides of the same, kind of going back to Hobbes and all this sort of thing, right? First thing Hobbes does is he atomizes people and then he creates Leviathan, basically, sort of theorizes Leviathan. So, yeah, so I think he would, so remember, at the end of Democracy in America, he sort of muses on what could go wrong, basically, right? And one of the things that he talks about is the sort of innervation that happens when people become atomized and when the government becomes too strong, and there isn't this the habit of what's the term he uses? Something like the habit of association or something like that.
Mhm.
We lose the habit of association.
Science of association or something, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly.
The mother of science,
Yeah, yeah. And so, I think what he would, I don't think he would be surprised, actually. I think what he would say is, I kind of saw this coming, I was hoping it wouldn't, and in some sense, religion for him was, he thought could, if it went this way, could act as a bulwark against some of that atomization. It teaches the art of association, it teaches forms, right? That there are kind of forms that are important, right? Political institutions only work if people respect them, right? And there are certain kinds of like forms and say, formalisms and that sort of thing that come along with functioning institutions of any sort, right? Why am I wearing a tie right now? Well, it's appropriate to the kind of thing that we're doing, right? It's conventional. Need I do that? Well, you could deconstruct it if you wanted to, but the point is that there are certain forms that are appropriate to certain things. Okay, so religion is the kind of thing that teaches those kinds of things for Tocqueville. When democracy sort of, if it's allowed to kind of go too far for him, it becomes atomized, forms drop off, you lose the art of association, and then you get this kind of overweening government. And so, again, I just say all to say, I don't think he'd be surprised. He might, yeah, so anyway.
I was just saying, there are two things in Democracy in America that he says reign without obstacle, right? There are two things that have a power that has no obstacle. It's the majority in America. And there are no obstacles. And he maintains that. Like, he talks about the Constitution, he talks about all of these things, but he says, in the end, anything you put up as the sort of dikes and dams of, against it, it's not going to stand. It doesn't back down on that. And so in some ways, I think he's sort of like, and because he has this great line, which is crazy to me, right? He says, the Federalists were out of touch. The Constitution was fortunate, but it was against the overall movement and idea of democracy in America. Because it was concerned with forms, because there seemed to be a sort of limit on popular power. That's not right, the sort of movement. But he says it was really good and fortunate, right? But ultimately it's going to be more way over time. But then the other thing he says, reigns without obstacle in America, is Christianity. Christianity rules there without obstacle. Now, right, if you say, right, the majority rules without obstacle, right, but it is a Christian majority, then the majority itself, there are no obstacles to it, but it places sort of restraints on itself. So, now, this is not really answering your question, but I think that, but it goes to the heart of, okay, so what now? If that majority, it's the same, that hasn't changed, that the majority rules without obstacle, but it's a fundamentally different type of majority.
So
What do you do?
as a follow-up question then, if the question is, what should people of faith be doing in government, rather than should they walk away, does that not mean that their work is actually evangelical in nature in order to move the majority back to being a Christian majority?
So this is the sort of critique you hear sometimes. Bishops are too political, they should be worried about it's saving souls, right, first, and concentrate on that, and the political consequences will sort of follow.
Yeah. And to,
It's an
to
interesting
give a
principle.
practical example, the gay marriage vote, right? I think the integralists would argue, if you could just like take power, you can wield it for the good. I think Republicans and people of faith, kind of on team good guy, would say, our team isn't even aligned on this issue. So it's not really about
Yeah,
taking
right.
the majority, right? You don't even have the will to like wield those levers if you have the opportunity to.
Yeah, the church hasn't gotten itself together, right, that's, you know.
I mean, God respects our freedom, right? And so I think we have to do that for one another too, which means we have to persuade people to just, I mean, there's a time and place for just ensuring that the law is right. But if you outlaw things without making the argument for what's wrong about it, then it might, even if you could get to that point, I don't know as if you can, but even if you could, it's gonna be short-term gain, I think long-term loss, right? Then you're in the position that the French are in, right? Now you see a political regime aligned with a church, and as soon as you get power back over that political regime, to hell with the church, right? And, you know, if the integralists were able to advance in that way, I think they would, you know, even if they had some victories early on, I think in the long term it would do more damage. I'm not sure they'll have any victories in the short term, but that would be my worry with that. One thing Tocqueville, to go back to Tocqueville, one thing he says in one of my favorite chapters in Democracy in America, on the point of departure, he says that no matter what comes for America, Americans are going to be religious. And if Christianity isn't their religion, they'll adopt a different religion, right? Secularism is kind of like a religion, and Americans embrace this. Americans who embrace secularism do so with this religious fervor. Tocqueville, he's very, very clever. He says the beginning of America is not the Declaration of Independence; it's the Puritans coming to America, and that puritanical instinct, he said, is baked into our political soul. And so if
Catholics are
yeah, right. So, I mean, if Catholics could tap into that, right, that's maybe one way of having a lot of influence. But you know, it's tough to do that. It's really tough to do that. So Tocqueville wrote the whole book, as he says in the introduction, because we need a new science of politics to deal with new problems, right? New political situations, and he gives us a really, really good start on thinking about how to maintain a democratic Republican regime in America. Right? But we actually have to do it. Right? It takes a lot of hard work, and that hard work consists in making good arguments, persuading people, and you can't persuade people without showing them goodwill, showing them friendship, which is one of the pillars that you mentioned at the beginning, right? So without some form of civic friendship and building up of trust, it's really, really difficult to get people to listen to you.
Well, we've gone a while, so with that, maybe I would encourage the conversation to continue, but over drinks and food, and thank you.
Thank you.